would you do if you were faced with an impossible situation? A widow with nothing but a small jar of oil, a mother holding the lifeless body of her son. These were not just stories of desperation, but moments when faith collided with the miraculous. Elisha, a man chosen by God, stepped into the impossible and witnessed God's power at work. But how did a simple man like Elisha become a vessel for such incredible miracles? Could it be that God still works in this way today? Imagine watching as a few drops of oil keep flowing, filling jar after jar, and witnessing the dead rise again by the hand of a prophet. What must have gone through the minds of those who saw Elisha at work? These were not just acts of supernatural power. They were signs of a God who cares deeply for the needs of his people. But what does it take to unlock such miracles? Is it possible that the same God who moved through Elisha is waiting to move through you? Elisha's journey began when the great prophet Elijah was nearing the end of his earthly ministry. Elijah, known for his boldness and miracles, was a giant in Israel's prophetic tradition. When it was time for Elijah to pass the mantle, God directed him to Elisha, a humble farmer. Elisha wasn't from a priestly line or a royal family. He was an ordinary man working the land. But God saw something in Elisha, a heart ready to serve, and the moment of calling arrived unexpectedly. When Elijah found Elisha plowing his fields, he cast his cloak upon him, symbolizing the transfer of prophetic authority. Elisha understood the significance immediately and left everything behind, his home, his livelihood, and his family, to follow Elijah. This decision was not taken lightly. It was an act of complete surrender. From that moment forward, Elisha became Elijah's devoted apprentice, learning what it meant to be God's mouthpiece in a troubled and rebellious nation. As Elijah's time on earth drew to a close, Elisha made a bold request. Knowing that Elijah's departure was near, he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request was not out of greed, but out of a deep desire to carry on the prophetic mission with even greater effectiveness. Elisha understood the weight of the calling and wanted to be equipped for the task. Elijah, recognizing the sincerity of Elisha's request, told him it would only happen if he witnessed Elijah's ascension. In a dramatic and miraculous moment, Elisha witnessed Elijah being taken up into heaven in a whirlwind, accompanied by chariots of fire. The mantle of Elijah fell to Elisha, confirming that God had granted his request. The double portion was his, and the miraculous power of God would now flow through him in ways Israel had never seen before. Elisha was no longer just a follower, he was now the leader, tasked with guiding God's people through divine intervention. The transition from Elijah to Elisha was seamless, but it also marked a new chapter in Israel's history. While Elijah had been a prophet of confrontation, boldly challenging kings and false prophets, Elisha's ministry would be marked by compassion, provision, and miraculous care for the people. The stage was set for Elisha to not only carry on the legacy of Elijah, but to surpass him in miracles and divine encounters, showing that God's power was not limited by human expectations. Elisha's first act as a prophet demonstrated the double portion he had received. Striking the Jordan River with Elijah's cloak, the waters parted, just as they had for his predecessor. This was a clear sign that God's hand was now upon Elisha in the same way it had been on Elijah. The prophets who had witnessed this were astonished and recognized that Elisha was now the spiritual leader of Israel. Elisha's journey as the prophet of miracles had begun, and it would soon impact the lives of countless individuals. Elisha's story is one of ordinary beginnings turned extraordinary by God's calling. He didn't come from a background of power or influence, but his willingness to leave everything behind and follow God's leading set him apart. His double portion was not about personal gain, but about being empowered to fulfill the purpose God had for him. This teaches us that when God calls, he also equips, and what we may lack in status or ability, God more than makes up for with his power. As Elisha embraced his new role, the people of Israel watched closely. Would he live up to the expectations left by Elijah? Would the miracles continue? They didn't have to wait long to find out. Elisha's ministry would soon be marked by powerful miracles that showed God's deep concern for both the great and the small, the rich and the poor, the mighty and the weak. The first of these miracles would begin with a woman in desperate need. In the village, a widow faced the unthinkable. She had lost her husband, a man who had served alongside Elisha, and now creditors were coming to take her sons as payment for her debts. This woman was at her wit's end, with nothing left but a small jar of oil. In her desperation, she sought out Elisha, hoping that the man of God could provide a solution. She had no resources, no hope, but she had faith that God could still make a way. Elisha, moved by her plight, asked her a simple yet profound question. "What do you have in your house?" It It wasn't a question of pity, but one that pointed to a deeper truth, that even in our most desperate moments, God can use what little we have. The widow responded that all she had was a small jar of oil. Elisha then instructed her to gather as many empty vessels as she could find from her neighbors and to pour the oil into them. The widow, though perplexed, obeyed without question. She and her sons gathered vessels from every corner of the village, filling their home with empty jars. Then, in an act of faith, she began to pour. Miraculously, the oil kept flowing. Jar after jar, the oil continued to pour until every vessel was filled to the brim. The little she had was multiplied in her hands, and her obedience unlocked the miracle that God had prepared for her. What seemed impossible became a reality. When the last jar was filled, the oil finally stopped flowing. The widow, overwhelmed with gratitude and awe, returned to Elisha with the news. Elisha told her to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and live on the remaining funds. In one miraculous moment, her life was transformed. What began as a hopeless situation had been completely reversed by God's provision. The widow's faith, though small, had been enough for God to work a miracle in her life. This story of the widow's oil is more than just a miracle of provision. It is a testament to the power of faith in the face of despair. The widow didn't know how her situation would change, but she trusted that God, through his prophet, would make a way. Her willingness to obey Elisha's instructions, even when they didn't make sense, was the key to unlocking the abundance God had in store for her. Sometimes the greatest miracles come from the simplest acts of faith. Elisha's role in the widow's miracle highlights an important truth about how God works. Elisha didn't create the oil, God did. But Elisha was the vessel through which the miracle flowed. This reminds us that God often chooses to work through his people, using their faith and obedience to bring about his supernatural intervention. Elisha's calm confidence in God's provision shows that he knew who was truly in control. He didn't need to perform, he simply needed to trust and follow God's leading. The miracle of the widow's oil also speaks to God's heart for those in need. In a society where widows were often marginalized and overlooked, God showed that he cares deeply for those who are vulnerable. The widow's situation may have seemed insignificant to the world, but it was important to God. Through this miracle, God demonstrated his ability to meet the needs of the least among us. He is a God who sees, who cares, and who provides. For us today, the story of the widow's oil is a reminder that no matter how small our resources or how dire our situation, God is able to multiply what we have when we place it in his hands. The question Elisha asked the widow, "What do you have?" is the same question God asks us. What do we have that we can offer to him? When we respond in faith, God can take the little we have and turn it into something far greater than we could ever imagine. Elisha's ministry continued to touch lives, and one of the most notable encounters involved a wealthy woman from Shunem. This woman, recognizing Elisha as a man of God, extended hospitality to him, offering him a place to stay whenever he passed through the area. In gratitude for her kindness, Elisha wanted to bless her in return. Despite her wealth, the woman had no children and her husband was old. It seemed impossible for her to have a child, but God had other plans. Elisha, moved by her generosity, prophesied that within a year she would hold a son in her arms. The woman, though appreciative, found it hard to believe. After all, she had long given up on the dream of becoming a mother. But true to God's word, a year later, the impossible became possible. The Shunammite woman gave birth to a son, fulfilling Elisha's prophecy. Her joy was overwhelming as she held the child that she had once thought was beyond her reach. For years, the Shunammite woman's son grew and thrived. He was a living testament to God's faithfulness and the power of Elisha's prophetic ministry. But just when life seemed perfect, tragedy struck. One day, while working in the fields with his father, the boy suddenly fell ill. His condition worsened rapidly, and before his mother could do anything, he died in her arms. The joy she had experienced in his birth was now replaced by the deepest sorrow. The Shunammite woman, however, refused to give up. She placed her son's lifeless body on Elisha's bed, and without telling anyone, she set out to find the prophet. Her faith was unshaken. She believed that Elisha, through God's power, could bring her son back to life. When she reached Elisha, her desperation was clear, but so was her faith. She clung to the hope that the God who had given her this child could also restore him. Elisha, moved by the woman's faith and urgency, returned to her home. There, he found the boy lying dead on his bed. Elisha prayed to God for intervention, and then stretched himself out over the child's body, praying fervently. Slowly, warmth returned to the boy's body, and after a few moments, he sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The boy was alive. God had performed a miracle of resurrection. And once again, Elisha had been the vessel of God's power. The Shunammite woman's faith, even in the face of death, is a powerful example of trust in God's ability to do the impossible. She didn't know how or when her son would be restored, but she believed that God, through Elisha, could bring him back to life. Her story reminds us that faith doesn't always mean the absence of doubt or fear, but it does mean trusting God even when the situation seems beyond hope. God is always able to breathe life into what seems dead. This miracle of resurrection points to the ultimate power of God over life and death. Elisha was not the source of the miracle, God was. But Elisha's faith and obedience allowed God's power to flow through him. In the same way, God can use us as vessels of his power if we are willing to trust and obey, even in the most impossible situations. The Shunammite woman's story shows us that when we refuse to give up on God, we open the door to the miraculous. For us today, the story of the Shunammite woman is a reminder that no situation is beyond God's reach. Whether it's the death of a dream, a relationship, or even a loved one, God is able to bring restoration and life where there was once despair. Our faith, like the Shunammite's, is the key to unlocking God's miraculous intervention in our lives. The question is, are we willing to trust him, even when all hope seems lost? The scene was heart-wrenching. A mother holding the lifeless body of her son, the very child that had been promised to her by God. In her desperation, she did not give in to grief, but chose to act in faith. She laid her son on Elisha's bed, a place of prayer and divine encounters, and set out on a journey to find the prophet. Her faith was relentless. She wasn't ready to accept death as the final answer. She believed in a miracle, and she sought it out. When the Shunammite woman reached Elisha, her words were filled with urgency and faith. She clung to the hope that the same God who had given her this child could bring him back to life. Elisha, moved by her determination, returned with her to the house. He found the boy lifeless, but Elisha didn't waver. He prayed and stretched himself out over the boy, not once, but twice, calling on God to intervene. The tension was palpable. Would God restore life to the child? Then, in a moment that can only be described as miraculous, the boy's body warmed, and he sneezed 7 times. His eyes opened, and he was alive. Elisha called for the boy's mother, and when she saw her son restored to life, her grief turned to overwhelming joy. What had been dead was now alive. This was more than a miracle. It was a demonstration of God's power over life and death, and a testament to the faith of a mother who refused to give up. Elisha's role in this miracle reminds us of the power of prayer and obedience. He didn't perform magic or use any special incantations. He simply prayed and trusted God to do the impossible. This story highlights that God's miracles are not dependent on our abilities, but on our willingness to act in faith. Elisha's obedience in stretching himself over the boy and calling on God shows that when we partner with God, extraordinary things can happen. The resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son also points to the larger truth that God is the giver of life. Just as he breathed life into Adam in the beginning, he continues to breathe life into situations that seem beyond hope. The story of this resurrection foreshadows the ultimate victory over death through Jesus Christ, who would later defeat death once and for all. Elisha's miracle is a glimpse of the greater resurrection that was to come. For the Shunammite woman, this miracle was not just about her son, it was about her faith. She refused to accept defeat, even when the situation seemed final. Her journey to find Elisha was an act of faith, and her persistence paid off. Her story reminds us that when we hold on to faith, even in the darkest moments, God can turn our mourning into joy. The death and resurrection of her son show that nothing is too difficult for God. This story also challenges us to examine our own faith. Are we willing to seek God in the face of impossibility? Do we trust him to bring life to the areas of our lives that seem dead? The Shunammite woman's faith wasn't perfect, but it was persistent. She believed that God, through Elisha, could perform a miracle, and she was right. Her story is a testament to the power of faith and the miraculous ways God works in response to our trust in him. As we reflect on this miracle, we are reminded that God is still in the business of resurrection. Whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual death, God can bring new life. He is the God of the impossible, and he invites us to trust him, just as the Shunammite woman trusted Elisha. Her faith opened the door for a miracle, and our faith can do the same today. The question is, will we trust God enough to believe that he can bring life to what seems dead? In every miracle that Elisha performed, one constant theme emerged: faith. Whether it was the faith of the widow with the oil or the persistence of the Shunammite woman, belief in God's power was the key that unlocked the miraculous. Elisha's ministry was marked by supernatural events, but each one was a response to someone's faith. It was as if God was saying, "If you believe, I will show you what I can do." Faith wasn't just a requirement, it was the foundation of every miracle. The widow's faith, though small, was enough for God to multiply the oil and provide for her family. The Shunammite woman's faith, though tested by grief, was enough for God to bring her son back to life. Elisha was the prophet through whom these miracles flowed, but it was the faith of ordinary people that made these extraordinary events possible. Their belief, even in the face of impossibility, invited God's power into their situations. Faith, however, wasn't just about believing in miracles, it was about trusting in God's character. The people who came to Elisha weren't just looking for magic tricks, they were seeking the intervention of a God they knew to be faithful and good. Their faith wasn't in Elisha's abilities, but in the God who worked through him. This distinction is important because it shows us that faith is not about the size of our belief, but about the object of our belief. Elisha's role as a prophet was to point people back to God. Though he performed many miracles, he never took credit for them. He knew that it was God's power, not his own, that was at work. This humility allowed Elisha to remain a vessel of God's miraculous intervention. He understood that faith in God's power, not in his own abilities, that was the key to unlocking the supernatural. Elisha's ministry reminds us that true faith always points back to God. The miracles of Elisha challenge us to examine our own faith. Are we willing to believe that God can do the impossible in our lives? Do we trust him enough to take bold steps of obedience even when the outcome is uncertain? Faith is not passive, it requires action. The widow had to gather jars. The Shunammite woman had to seek out Elisha. Their faith moved them to act, and in response, God moved powerfully in their lives. For Elisha, faith was more than just a belief in the miraculous. It was a deep trust in God's character and faithfulness. Elisha knew that God could be trusted, even in the most difficult situations. This trust allowed him to walk confidently into impossible circumstances, knowing that God would provide a way. Elisha's faith was not in his own abilities, but in the God who had called him. This trust empowered him to be a vessel of God's miraculous power. The role of faith in Elisha's ministry also speaks to the importance of partnership with God. Elisha didn't perform miracles on his own, he worked in cooperation with God's will. This partnership required faith, both from Elisha and from those who sought his help. It's a reminder that God often chooses to work through human agents, using their faith to accomplish his purposes. Elisha's miracles show us that when we partner with God, extraordinary things happen. For us today, the story of Elisha's miracles invites us to step out in faith, trusting that God is still at work in our lives. Whether we're facing financial difficulties like the widow or seemingly insurmountable challenges like the Shunammite woman, God invites us to believe that he can and will intervene. Our faith, no matter how small, can open the door to the miraculous. The question is, are we willing to trust God and act in faith, even when the outcome is uncertain? Despite the incredible miracles that marked his ministry, Elisha remained a humble servant of God's power. He never sought glory for himself or claimed credit for the supernatural events that took place through him. Instead, Elisha always pointed back to God as the true source of the miracles. His humility allowed him to be a vessel for God's power, and his willingness to serve others showed that his ministry was not about personal fame, but about meeting the needs of God's people. Elisha's humility is perhaps most evident in the way he approached each miracle. Whether it was multiplying oil for a widow or raising a child from the dead, Elisha never made a spectacle of himself. He didn't draw attention to his role as a miracle worker. Instead, he focused on the needs of those who came to him for help. This humility is what made Elisha such an effective prophet. He knew that it was not about him, but about God working through him. Even when others tried to elevate him, Elisha remained grounded. He understood that his power came from God, and he refused to let pride take root in his heart. Elisha's humility stands in stark contrast to the arrogance of some leaders who seek to build their own empires. Instead of using his gifts for personal gain, Elisha used them to serve others and to glorify God. His ministry was marked by selflessness and a deep desire to see God's will accomplished. Elisha's humility also allowed him to connect with people on a personal level. He wasn't distant or aloof. He was approachable and compassionate. Whether he was helping a widow in financial distress or comforting a grieving mother, Elisha's heart was always for the people. This connection with others made his ministry all the more powerful, because people knew that they could trust him. Elisha wasn't seeking glory, he was seeking to serve. In a world where power and fame often corrupt, Elisha's humility is a refreshing example of what it means to be a servant of God. He didn't need recognition or accolades because he knew that his reward came from God. Elisha's life teaches us that true greatness in God's kingdom comes not from seeking our own glory, but from humbly serving others. When we follow Elisha's example of humility, we too can become vessels of God's power. Elisha's humility also speaks to the importance of character in ministry. It's not enough to have gifts or abilities. What matters most is the heart behind those gifts. Elisha's heart was pure, and his motives were selfless. This allowed him to remain focused on God's purposes, even when others tried to elevate him. His humility kept him grounded and allowed him to continue serving faithfully throughout his life. For us today, Elisha's example challenges us to examine our own hearts. Are we seeking to serve God for our own glory, or are we truly focused on His kingdom? Do we humbly submit to His will, or are we trying to build our own empires? Elisha's life reminds us that true success in God's eyes is not measured by fame or recognition, but by our faithfulness and humility. When we serve with humility, God's power can flow through us in ways we never imagined. In the end, Elisha's humility was what made his ministry so effective. He knew that he was just a vessel, and he was content to let God take the glory. This is the kind of humility that God honors. When we recognize that it's not about us but about Him, we open ourselves up to be used in powerful ways. Elisha's life shows us that humility is the key to unlocking God's power in our lives. The question is, are we willing to humble ourselves and let God work through us? The miracles that Elisha performed were not just displays of God's power, they were acts of provision. Whether it was the widow's oil, the Shunammite woman's son, or the healing of Naaman, God showed time and time again that He cares deeply for the needs of His people. Elisha's ministry was marked by a series of miraculous provisions that demonstrated God's willingness to meet both physical and spiritual needs. In a time of famine, drought, and political unrest, God's provision through Elisha was a sign of His faithfulness. One of the most powerful examples of God's provision is found in the story of the widow's oil. This woman had nothing left, and her situation seemed hopeless. But through Elisha, God provided more than enough to meet her needs. The oil didn't just stop her from losing her sons to slavery, it also gave her the means to live comfortably for the rest of her life. This miracle shows that when God provides, He doesn't just meet our immediate needs, He goes above and beyond. The story of the Shunammite woman also highlights God's provision, but in a different way. She didn't need financial help. She needed the restoration of her son's life. In her deepest moment of despair, God provided exactly what she needed, the resurrection of her child. This miracle shows that God's provision is not limited to material needs. He is able to provide emotional, relational, and spiritual restoration as well. Whatever we need, God is able to supply. Elisha's ministry of provision extended even to those outside of Israel. Naaman, a Syrian commander, came to Elisha seeking healing from leprosy. Despite his status as an outsider and an enemy of Israel, God provided healing for Naaman. This miracle demonstrates that God's provision is not limited by nationality or background. He cares for all people, and His grace extends beyond the boundaries we set for ourselves. Elisha's ministry reminds us that God's love and provision are for everyone. The theme of provision runs throughout Elisha's life, showing that God is deeply concerned with the well-being of His people. Whether it's providing food in a time of famine or healing in a time of sickness, God's provision is always available. Elisha's miracles point to the larger truth that God is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. He is not distant or uninvolved. He is actively working in our lives to meet our needs, even when we don't see it. For us today, Elisha's miracles of provision serve as a reminder that God is still in the business of providing for His people. We may not see jars of oil multiplying or the dead being raised, but God's provision is no less real in our lives. Whether it's a financial breakthrough, a restored relationship, or healing from illness, God is able to meet our needs in ways we can't even imagine. The question is, do we trust Him to provide? God's provision is not always immediate, and it doesn't always come in the way we expect. The widow didn't expect her oil to multiply, and the Shunammite woman didn't expect her son to die, let alone be resurrected. But in both cases, God provided exactly what was needed at exactly the right time. Elisha's life shows us that we don't need to understand how God will provide. We just need to trust that He will. His timing is perfect, and His provision is always enough. In the end, Elisha's ministry of provision points us to the ultimate source of all provision, God Himself. Elisha was just the vessel through which God's miracles flowed, but it was God who provided. This is a reminder that, no matter what we're facing, God is more than able to meet our needs. Whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual, God's provision is available to us. The question is, will we trust Him to be our provider, just as Elisha trusted Him to be his? Elisha's life is a testament to the fact that miracles are not confined to the pages of Scripture. God is still at work today, performing miracles in the lives of His people. The same God who multiplied the widow's oil, raised the Shunammite's son, and healed Naaman, is the same God we serve today. But the question is, are we willing to believe that He can work in our lives just as He did in theirs? Do we have the faith to expect the miraculous? One of the key lessons from Elisha's ministry is the importance of faith. Miracles didn't happen in a vacuum. They were always accompanied by acts of faith. Whether it was the widow gathering jars or Naaman dipping himself in the Jordan, faith was the key that unlocked God's power. If we want to see God move in our lives, we must be willing to take steps of faith, even when the outcome is uncertain. Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. Elisha's miracles also remind us that God's power is not limited to certain people or situations. The widow was poor, the Shunammite woman was wealthy, and Naaman was a foreigner. Yet God worked in each of their lives because His love and power transcend all boundaries. No matter who we are or what we're going through, God is able to work miracles in our lives. The only limitation is our willingness to believe and receive what He has for us. In our modern world, it can be easy to dismiss the idea of miracles. We're surrounded by technology, science, and reason, and the supernatural can seem far removed from our everyday lives. But Elisha's story challenges us to look beyond the natural and to believe that God is still at work in the supernatural. Miracles are not relics of the past. They are a present reality for those who have faith. The question is, are we willing to open our hearts and minds to the possibility of the miraculous? Elisha's life also teaches us that miracles are not about personal gain. They are about God's glory. Elisha didn't perform miracles to build his own reputation or to gain followers. He performed miracles to meet the needs of people and to point them back to God. If we want to see miracles in our lives, we must approach them with the same heart. It's not about us, it's about Him. When we seek God's glory above all else, we open the door for His miraculous power to flow through us. For those of us facing impossible situations, Elisha's story is a beacon of hope. Whether we're dealing with financial struggles, health issues, or broken relationships, God is more than able to intervene. But we must be willing to trust Him, even when the situation seems hopeless. The widow didn't know how God would provide, but she trusted Him anyway. The Shunammite woman didn't know how her son would be restored, but she trusted Him anyway. Their faith opened the door for God's miracles, and ours can too. In the end, Elisha's life is a reminder that God is still at work, performing miracles in the lives of those who believe. The same God who worked through Elisha is the same God who works in our lives today. But the key to experiencing miracles is faith. Are we willing to trust God even when the outcome is uncertain? Are we willing to believe that He can do the impossible? If we are, then we can expect to see God move in miraculous ways. As we reflect on Elisha's story, we are left with a challenge. Will we trust God to be our provider, our healer, and our miracle worker? The same power that flowed through Elisha is available to us today, but it requires faith. Will we take the steps of faith necessary to see God move in our lives? The miracles are waiting. The only question is, are we ready to believe? What miracle are you waiting for? The same God who multiplied oil and raised the dead through Elisha's hands is ready to intervene in your life today. But are you willing to trust Him, to take that step of faith even when all hope seems lost? Maybe you're facing a situation that feels impossible. A financial crisis, a broken relationship, a health scare, but nothing is beyond His reach. Will you believe that He can make a way, just as He did for the widow and the Shunammite woman? Now is the time to step out in faith. You don't need to have it all figured out, just as the widow didn't know how her oil would multiply. But she trusted, and God provided. What will God do for you when you trust Him with your need? The miracles are waiting. The question is, are you ready to receive them? It's time to believe in the God of the impossible.